Hello there, and welcome to today's webinar, Future First Strategies for 2023 and beyond. Looks like we've got quite a few clients joining us today. We've got Google Hardware, Bacardi, I think, Santander, LVMH, the De Beers Group, L'Oreal. Looks like we've got Nottingham Trent University as well. Just to say that we're going to be monitoring the chat today. So if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A box or the chat function, and we'll have hopefully about 10 minutes at the end to answer as many questions as we can. So we're just going to screen share with you. Just bear with, here we go. Great. So I am Rachel, the Director of Strategy and Planning here at the Future Laboratory, and I'm joined today by Louise, who is our Strategy Director, and it is our team Strategy that provide consultancy services here at the lab. And yes, we've been going since 2001, but we still often hear from people and clients that don't know that we offer consultancy services. So we thought this was a great opportunity to showcase this and some of the programs and methodologies that we work with. So we work directly with global brands and businesses to turn the LSN Global Foresight into strategic decision-making tools that help align clients' current business objectives with these future scenarios. So it's about identifying innovations, value and growth, and we help you define future fit strategies. And we are a team, as I introduced Louise, of strategists, futurists, analysts and researchers. And when we approach the work that comes to us, we are method neutral. And instead, we are more focused on using that right combination of strategic research and futures tools to enlighten that business challenge. So we focus on identifying insights that enable our clients to rethink what they know about today and therefore refocus their brand and business plans on the consumer, the category, and or the context of tomorrow. And as I mentioned, kind of our methodology, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but when it comes to our research, we're always flexing. So that might mean from macro shifts and the bigger cultural landscape to micro signals. It might be from qualitative consumer research to quantitative data research, from global drivers, those kind of macro environmental factors, to like local micro trends and micro needs, and from kind of creative or cultural decoding through to strategy and commercial thinking.
So yeah, as Rachel's just said, in strategy, we use the LSN Global Foresight content that you might be more familiar with as a tool to help our clients rethink what they know today and refocus the brand and business plans on the consumer, the category and the context of tomorrow. And I'm just going to explain how this works by giving a quick overview of our primary methodology, because as Rachel said, we are method neutral, but this sits at the heart of everything we do. So at the heart of the Future Laboratory, we have this unique proprietary methodology that allows us to determine, define and track the key drivers of change and map their effect on the future. This approach to strategic foresight follows a process of reviewing cause and effect of global exploration to identify relevant threads and patterns with evidence to validate and prove them. So we start by looking at the drivers of change, as Rachel just mentioned, and we're constantly tracking what we call our global drivers. The impact of these is likely to be felt across a 10-year plus horizon. And these drivers represent the kind of global cultural, social, economic, political, technological and environmental forces that are reshaping the world we live in. And we can talk about them more in detail in a second. When we've looked at those drivers and we understand what is happening on that high level, we start to review how they are affecting us as humans by interrogating a set of what we call universal human needs. And again, I'm going to go into those in a bit more detail, but we think of these as the foundation of any society, past, present and future, based on a value system that supports human nature's complete physical and emotional programming. And these are unlikely to change. And it's action of those two things working together, we can assess the impact of those global drivers on our own needs as humans in order to see how the contemporary context is shaping and defining new ways in which people are striving to meet those human needs. And we call those value shifts, and they're ever-evolving signals visible today, which act as the foundations of any future thinking. And from that understanding, we can contextualize any large-scale cultural and societal shifts we are seeing, which are signaled and demonstrated by the adoption of new attitudes and behaviours of the people we look at most closely, innovators and early adopters, and that is worldwide. These are what we identify as macro trends, and we look to identify how early and late majority attitudes and behaviour might look approximately 3 to 5 years out by monitoring these. And then finally, we use what we call micro trends to show the visible signals and manifestations of the trend as it is established. These highlight tangible business innovations already emerging across key lifestyle categories and show how the trend is likely to manifest in the near term of around 1 to 3 years. So having gone through the methodology and the layers that we look at, I'm going to take you into a bit more detail on some of the really important aspects of that. So starting with the global drivers. Global drivers are the foundation of the Future Laboratories methodology and are internal intellectual property. As you can see here, they cover the most disruptive forces shaping the world today, from accelerating technology. So, for example, we'll be thinking about the impact that emerging AI technologies could have on us as a society, to climate change or the climate crisis and resource scarcity. So exploring potential responses to one of the most critical and existential inflection points we'll have faced as a species. These 6 drivers you can see on screen have been developed from extensive research, data captured by our internal FRS, what we call the Foresight Research System, which is a live internal database that we use that is updated by our extensive network of analysts and researchers. And the drivers are tracked and updated regularly, and we're actually doing this at the moment to think about how they've evolved since 2020. And we'll be looking to detect changes and fluctuations that are happening at this level. So we audit the global drivers annually through extensive steep research and meta-analyze the findings with broader industry publications, white papers, reports to determine the most prominent factors that are going to define the future for everyone. And so going back to the human needs that we covered as the second layer in the methodology that we're looking at and the interaction between these two things, every day we make decisions and take action in our lives based on what we think, how we feel and believe is most important. So while those global drivers change slowly over time, our fundamental human needs are timeless and universal and fixed. Across centuries and geographies, these needs persist as part of humanity's essential physical and emotional programming, and our physiological and social needs are essential to our survival as humans. But we also know that these needs are prioritized, they're expressed and pursued differently at different moments in time, and they're being driven by those global drivers, and they become more of a reflection of the contemporary world. So as such, you could understand the 7 needs that we have here. We look to as a convergence and a flattening of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Tony Robbins' human needs, which within his work suggests that many of our behaviours are based on which of our needs are or are not being met, being met at any one time. And this removes the idea of progress or hierarchy that you start to see in Maslow's, and treats each of these needs as equal and relevant depending on the context of who, what, and where. And so it's by exploring the interaction between those static human needs and the evolving global drivers in the context of any specific client challenge or question that we're being asked, that we can identify the relevant value shifts and therefore the macro trends that will be the foundation of our strategic offer. So on to the macro trends, and I'm sure you'll recognise some of these. As we've said previously, macro trends are the major shifts in attitude and behaviour that will dictate the business environment and consumer landscape in the long term that we use as strategic tools for our clients, so embedding that understanding of what's happening in the future landscape. So we publish and unveil these big picture changes whose effects stretch across categories and consumer types. And we do this 8 times per year on LSN Global. So these comprehensive research documents become the focal point or foundation for much of our client-specific consultancy work. We're going to use one of our most recent macro trends as an example of how this works at a high level for you now.
Great. So that was a whistle-stop tour of our proprietary methodology. And as Louise said, whether across the business, whether it's our team of strategy that work with the clients or the LSN Global team, that sits at the heart of everything we do. And it creates that taxonomy and kind of hierarchy and structure to really help clients understand how they can link an action that they can take today right back to some of these pervasive shifts that are still maybe occurring quite slowly over the next 10 years. So as Louise said, we're going to look at the latest macro trend. So this is a 3 to 5 year macro trend that's looking at the cultural shifts that are happening. And this was called the Paralysis Paradox. And this was one of the biggest trends for this year, that we authored this year for next year. And this new macro trend really explores how brands must step up and become forces for change and drawing on their expertise, assets and reach to equip, collaborate and horizon map with citizens. And it's really the idea that there is now so much at stake, that the threats we face are now so existential, so frequent that we're paralyzed by fear, by anxiety, by pessimism, all of which are clouding our ability to locate the right path forward, despite as either businesses or as humans or consumers wanting to. And as you can see here on screen, it's a bit of an overview of our executive summary of that. So yeah, it's moving quite fast, but you can see it covers from human needs to global drivers, the insight, the foresight, and of course the strategic implications. And if you want to know more about this trend and those macro trends that Louise went through a minute ago, then yeah, you will need to become a member of our Trends Intelligence platform, LSN Global, and you can read these articles in full. So yeah, if you're interested in that, please join our membership. And so when we authored the Paralysis Paradox through LSN Global, Louise is now going to start to take us through kind of how strategies start to work with that foresight.
Thanks, Rachel. So we consider the paralysis paradox to be one of our, what we call a leadership trend. So this means instead of looking at a consumer or a category specific behavior, it starts to expand the aperture to consider the wider holistic business landscape. And that's why we wanted to share it with you today. So it's as applicable to as many people as possible, rather than looking into one of our specific category macro trends. So as such, this can apply to any business. And when we consider providing strategic direction, which, you know, here we've called the solution, it shows how the business itself can adapt rather than any one particular team or function, such as marketing, for example. So when translating cultural foresight, and we think of that as what is happening outside of your business, into tailored strategic direction for the business, so suggested actions that would be happening in response, we first look to identify the relevant strategic insights that we can see within the foresight research. So what changes are going to affect you, why will they affect you, and how are they going to affect you? That indicates why a trend is important to you and what it might mean for you in the long term. So from the Paralysis Paradox, which is not applied to any business in particular, we identified 3 strategic insights that highlighted and contextualized the need, direction, and opportunities for change. So the first strategic insight that we could find within the kind of the really rich research that had been done within the team was this need for urgency. So from that research, we found that more than 30 years have passed since the UN recognised climate change as a serious issue, and it is now predicted that we've only got 3 to 4 years to reverse its impact. So this indicates a really urgent need for significant change of approach, which is accelerating as time to take meaningful and reparative action dwindles. The second insight that we had here was influence. So understanding that the youth of today will be influential brand citizens of tomorrow. And so really looking to them to kind of align with them and their values. So with young people, deeply entrenched values and a justified cynicism about business that's not going to be, you know, kind of mended by empty promises, businesses that underestimate their influence on the shape of the future are going to do so at their peril. This indicates the need for businesses to shift focus, approach to meet the expectations of this new audience, and in this case also an internal audience, thinking about their future employees. And finally, responsibility. So the final insight that came from the trend is that change is not the responsibility of just one societal segment, but if we think about business and individuals and governments and political action, businesses are the ones that can act as politics continues to embrace wishful thinking. So using financial and cultural influence, those businesses that are brave are going to make a choice to set themselves on the right side of this turning point. And this indicates a real need and opportunity for businesses to step up and take charge of the situation, rather than waiting for governments or consumers to do it for them. So we translate these insights into a strategic direction and a strategic kind of the crux of everything. And we unpack this across a strategic framework that describes the change that needs to happen and the actions that will enable it. So from the paralysis paradox, we could see a problem for businesses to overcome, because it's the very thing that they've stood for forever. This relentless drive for profit and pure shareholder value is going to cease to be viable or desirable in the future. So as a high-level strategic direction, businesses really need to think about adapting to a broader context of what success looks like, that accounts for impact and takes into account more than financial progress or any of those other traditional metrics of growth. And the framework and direction for this adaptation took the form of 3 pillars of leadership. So we looked at liability, legitimacy, and legacy, and each of those pillars has a set of actions that sit under each. So the first leadership pillar of liability reflected the need for a reformation of leadership in order to accept that liability and take responsibility, as we were just talking about. So this is really about reconfiguring traditional business structures and leadership qualities and rethinking everything that we know, because those things are restricting the innovation and new thinking that we so desperately need. Instead, we follow 3 strategic actions to prioritize fluidity, intuition, and collectivist consensus to lay the groundwork to activate new positive future possibilities. And so the 3 strategic actions that we can see here are, the first one, embracing soft metrics of leadership. So rethinking the C-suite, changing priorities to be more around empathy, flexibility, and clarity rather than just revenue, and having the fortitude and bravery to make decisions that will benefit employees and society over commercial KPIs. Secondly, really importantly, something we're seeing coming up time and time again, opening up to thinking from the global south. So things that might have been overlooked before, combining intuitive expertise from indigenous groups with data in order to unlock overlooked viable solutions, in order to establish credible environmental guardianship. So we can learn so much from areas that have been overlooked for centuries, really. And then finally, decentralizing decision making. And I'm sure that everyone's kind of hearing a lot of the ripples around DAOs, DASOs at the moment, those different business structures. Moving to these models can decentralize decision making and empower joint accountability and responsibility for the trajectory of the business. And that's going to be so important for navigating the kind of uncertainty that we see today.
Amazing. So that was the first one. Our second part of the framework was legitimacy. And as Louise said, we carried through this to look at some of the actions to start to help different brands and businesses kind of start to unpack that macro trend and really think about what this could mean to the future. And this was really this focus on providing organizational expertise through cooperation, empathy, and engagement. So the 3 strategic actions that we highlighted here, first was to redirect marketing to action over consumption. So this was really about how brands and businesses can think about their marketing spend and their marketing budget and reach. So repositioning that instead of potentially, you know, a lot of brands selling consumer goods and getting people to buy that product, but really thinking about marketing more holistically, and could it be thought leadership? And that would mean rethinking the tonality of communications, where you show up, how you spend the budget, but really, you know, an opportunity, instead of trying to target one product and one part of your segmentation, to really think about how can we actually start to bring people together to fight for something maybe bigger than this, and use our brand and our voice and our collateral to make real change. The second one was to react or be reactive via contextualized data, and knowing that, I think now with our global drive and looking at accelerated technology, with the opportunity to access so much data, that actually it's that context-rich data that can really drive some future creative disruption. So within businesses, we hear a lot with the clients that we work with that there isn't really a democratization of data in organizations, that potentially we're working in silo. One team has access to some insights, another team through their data has another, but they don't necessarily share it and aren't necessarily looking for that high level insight that can drive change. So how can brands really start to think about breaking some of those barriers and elevating the synergies between the insights that different teams are seeing, and thinking more laterally, being more cooperative and engaging to together find some of these solutions to a better future. And then lastly, in legitimacy, we had be youth focused is being future focused. And this was really reiterating from the trend to clients around finding ways to connect with culture and with youth culture, knowing that there's alphas and especially Gen Z that are now, they do have that spending power. How can we actually bring their point of view, their understanding, it's their future that we're talking about. How do we bring their opinions and their thoughts into the business? So this might be, through qualitative and quantitative data, how you collect those insights, who you're speaking to, how you're going about that, but also from things like supporting with outside learning beyond typical academia, knowing that Gen Z aren't necessarily going to university and studying in the same way that older generations might have done. And we also saw, and we're seeing, that brands are also tapping into or creating these youth councils. So, not necessarily having Gen Z working through the company in every position in every department, but actually bringing people together that they can cooperate and collaborate with and test bed ideas to make sure that those opinions are counted.
I think that's, another really great way of thinking about decentralizing decision making and making it much more democratic. And the final pillar that we are speaking to looks to organizations to take ownership of the long-term impact they're going to have, embrace uncertainty in order to really progress and really make change. And I think that's thinking about the legacy, embedding a legacy for the future. And so the strategic actions, this is a subject that comes up a lot, and thinking about, we all have to be thinking about what we stand for and what we will be remembered for standing for in the future. These actions can be employed to really achieve this. And so the first one, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is activating desirable futures. So exploring multiple future scenarios, not just thinking about the kind of one fixed future that we're heading towards, because we know we could take any amount of different directions and end up in a different place, but really kind of setting a stake in the ground across multiple different future potential scenarios, and then taking a backcasting approach to instigating action towards what we think of as desirable futures. So looking at all of those futures and thinking about, what do we want to happen and how are we going to make that happen? And so this comes about from using AI data modeling in tandem with those really important skill sets of EQ and the human factors for more holistic future scenario planning. So kind of really relying on data and technology for the kind of fact-based stuff, but really thinking about how it's going to affect us as humans as well. And really supporting these by, implementing new roles such as a chief vision officer, having someone at the helm whose job it is to kind of really dream, but also has permission to take action. And so the second one we have in terms of creating a legacy that we think is so important, and there's a lot of people talking about this idea of citizens at the moment, but really putting citizens, thinking citizens, not consumers, putting people first. So prioritizing citizens' needs over consumption, embracing deep tech collaboration in order to cross-pollinate emerging, existing, and before now unimagined technologies for cross-sector opportunities and product hybrids. So really thinking about when we're innovating, how can we make sure those innovations are helpful? How can we make sure they are focused on betterment for not just for the business, but for everyone, and really putting it at the forefront and becoming, much more valuable to society, and kind of raising the purpose of a business beyond just pure consumption. And then finally, embedding innovation across the business. And we see this so often, avoid putting sustainability in a CSR box. Do not silo innovation. These are, so often these are considered, entirely separate functions to the rest of the business. And it's so important to start embedding this, the approaches that are taken here, the types of thinking and the design thinking that go hand in hand with those areas, really kind of bringing them into the business and embedding it across all teams and all functions. So embedding a culture of innovation across the business. And so that should give some insight into the kind of entry level, as we think of it, strategic foresight. So this is when it's not yet been applied to a specific client challenge or a question, and some, provide some real world challenges and actions that we can all learn from. But from here, it becomes increasingly tailored and bespoke. And we're going to talk a bit about some of the other things we do.
Yeah, so as Louise mentioned, that's kind of how we work with LSN Global, authoring a trend and then unpacking that, and the beginnings of that strategic foresight and what that means to brands and businesses. So as we mentioned at the top, we sit in strategy in the consultancy services, and we work directly with brands and businesses. So the consultancy services kind of exist in a set of programs that range from foresight programs to strategy programs. And it's our foresight programs that contextualize contemporary culture for our businesses. They offer clients a rich point of view of the future, highlighting those influences of change, therefore the opportunities and the challenges, and they are framed around our proprietary methodology, so really helping clients to navigate that hierarchy from drivers to shifts to trends to signals, and then to those implications and actions that can be taken today. And they really give our clients that solid foundation, which Louise mentioned, like bringing innovation outside of just one siloed team is a chance for everybody across the organization to have that solid foundation on which to shape their foresight literacy and align themselves internally. And there's a multitude of trends to action programs that we use and roll out with clients. And it really depends on the time horizons. So whether clients want to understand what to do in the next 1 to 2 years, or if there's more focus on the scenario planning and far futures, or whether it's particular categories or pillars on their strategic or marketing plans, we can start to tailor and unpack those trends to really set the parameters and focus for our brands and businesses. And then the kind of other side of that, or the follow-on from that, are our strategy programs. And they're designed to provide direction. They're there to set a plan of action, a roadmap, to really help brands then, with that foresight, create sustainable value creation. So it's grounded in our foresight and that broader strategic context of the businesses that we work with. These are when a client really come to us, right, with a clear business challenge that really needs a clear solution and a clear path forward. And we aim to make that better future happen between today and tomorrow, whether for our brands and businesses tomorrow is 1 year, 2 years, 5 or 10 years from now. And then a quick overview here of those strategy programs that we offer. So from business growth strategy, that might be enabling clients to really build our foresight into short, medium and longer term implications and really unpacking those trends. And this would normally be around identifying those opportunity areas for growth, value and or value creation. And this might be helping to prioritize and determine a 3-5 year business plan across the business.
Yeah, and so I've just mentioned innovation and, you know, the huge role innovation is going to play in the future of all businesses. So we offer an innovation strategy program. So this is about capturing, converting those trend-based opportunities. So what we're seeing in the trend and turning that into opportunities or identifying the right opportunities for a business into validated platforms for innovation and providing a really clear framework for ideating, product development, creation and execution. So making sure any innovation is directed, aligned with your brand and your business strategy, but also future fit and culturally relevant. Secondly, we have brand and communication strategy. So again, thinking about how we can, especially something that communications is something that changes so quickly, but we work with our clients to enable them to define the brand parameters today in order to frame the shifts that will affect them tomorrow. So determining what a future fit value proposition or a positioning is and defining a brand strategy, creating a roadmap for ongoing success. So really tailoring brands to that kind of cultural landscape of the future and enabling a brand to kind of last for longer in a world that changes constantly. And then the last one in terms of the kind of brand and creative areas is our creative strategies. So enabling clients to inspire and direct their design teams and partners, taking macro consumer trends into really actionable design toolkits. So, and these become relevant for developing new products, service and experience strategies.
Yeah, and then lastly, we have a placemaking or mixed strategy. So that's really where we work with clients who are building a community and a future fit sense of place, usually, you know, our property and placemaking developers, and really translating then foresight into different either placemaking master plans or retail mixed strategies that really deliver cultural and commercial value in what is becoming quite increasingly complex landscape. So the last thing we want to just quickly take you through before we take some questions from you is one of our foresight programs, which focuses on far futures. And as Louise mentioned under legacy in the Paralysis Paradox, one of those actions was activating those desirable futures, thinking about the futures, plural, is becoming really key. And we've been doing this type of work with Adidas and this year with Dell, Bacardi, Lansec, etc. So it's becoming something that more and more clients are coming to us for. And at the Future Laboratory, scenarios sketch out and the scope of possibilities and potential long-term futures. They consider the future from a number of possible lenses to create active orientation when opening up spaces for new forward-looking ways of thinking. And typically when we take on the far futures work, we're looking at a 4-stage process to really help our clients harness disruption proactively and strategically.
So the first stage of this is what we call identification and provocation. So here we undertake desk and visual research using our LSN Global platform, our trends intelligence tools, our FRS data, human-driven sector specialists that we have in our teams, and backcasting with the trend tracker to develop a point of view on the future landscape and understand, you know, how we got here and where we're likely to go. So this enables us to develop a foresight-led or future-first hypothesis to think about how the future landscape will look different from what we know today.
And then the second phase is that further interrogation. So this is where we start to really unpack the global drivers. This work being far futures, as we mentioned from the top, you know, 2030, 2040, 2050. It's really important that we really start by looking at the trajectory of those global drivers. So I think, as Louise mentioned, that's further steep factor analysis to really map and show the evidence of that trajectory over longer periods of time. We also interrogate and look at our future 1,000 innovators to get fresh reference points, to better understand how those really innovative sort of nascent brands and people are considering these global drivers, addressing these things and where newness is occurring. And then we start cross-referencing that with internal client research and conducting more strategic expert interviews through our Futures 1000 expert panel to really develop on those hypotheses and validate them. And then we synthesize all that research to really start to look for the commonalities and those strategic building blocks, or those constant things that we can start to measure across the different scenarios, those things that we believe are set to affect the future and capture those key opportunities and threats for clients. And so this is what drafting or sketching our scenarios look like, to create future scenarios based on different trajectories of those strategic building blocks. They kind of follow the 4 different types of scenarios laid out here. The first being a probable future. And this is, I suppose, the most predicted future as we know today. So naturally, this is based on the understanding of quite solid existing trajectories and knowledge, with very little change from the expected, and often looking for quite steady, imperative and incremental change. The second is at the top there, the really prosperous future. So scenarios here are ones which I guess we're seeing all the positive opportunities of those building blocks present themselves in the steep factors, and they really materialize. This is great because it's like the utopia, but the chances of this, of course, are slightly less likely. The problematic future is almost the opposite down there in the bottom, which is, the worst case scenario. This is full of threats. But it's important to track and be aware of them and think of the future in plural, because we've heard from a lot of our clients, especially those that we've done this programs pre-pandemic, have said that actually a lot of the scenarios and points within that problematic one actually came true during the pandemic, and have put a lot of pressure on brands and businesses that were ill prepared to actually start to imagine it and plan for it. And then we have the possible future. And this is kind of really where a lot of brands should be aiming. And this is that point of differentiation. It allows clients the chance to plan for macro trends, plan for those opportunities that we're starting to spot now, and start to build in contingency plans if the pandemic hits, as it did, and there are things around us that start to change pretty quickly.
Great. And then just to wrap up, and hopefully we've still got time for a few questions. I know we're running a little bit over, but really thinking the final stage here, really fascinating work when we do it. The most exciting bit for me being a strategist is when we start to take all of those learnings and the lessons from the research and the scenarios, and then strategically analyze those findings in the context of that initial research question. And you might find that also sometimes evolves through the process as well. The more we learn, the more we kind of orientate ourselves. But this helps us to identify key strategic implications for the business, and that empowers and inspires, core business teams to take actions and plan for the future now. And so the implications are unpacked and used to enable a brand to prioritize for strategic planning, identify and articulate the key future value creation areas. And I've seen a question come in around value creation, which is quite interesting, and define and frame the key strategic questions that we need to take forward for the future. And so as directives, they communicate the short-term tactical actions, mid-term plan and next steps, and long-term visionary investment plan and actions. And those are the real kind of key steps for, the title of this webinar was about, building strategies for the long term, and really thinking about, what are the steps in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, keeping that vision in mind all the way. So that's how we approach our Futures programme. And we're going to move over now to take a few questions. We've already got some through, so we'll start there. The first one I'm going to take is from Law from Framestore. So they say, given the economy ahead, any tips on protecting and proving value as a future-facing foresight planning person when everyone else is worried about resourcing in the here and now? And this is something we deal with every day. It's the number one question we get asked, so we're very excited to talk about it, and kind of that really taps into that far futures work, some of the things we were talking in the Paralysis Paradox, how important it is to, however short term we are thinking in terms of actions and trying to shore up and kind of mitigate risk, it's so important to have the long-term, trajectory and the long-term vision in mind when we're making those decisions. Because what happens when we lose sight of where we're aiming for, is that we'll end up off course. And, you know, then you're at the mercy of the currents of change. So it's so important to embed long-term thinking into everything. And, you know, some of the questions that we've seen were about, you know, having those conversations with, you know, team members or other parts of the business that don't really buy into it. And it's really about the, you know, the risk factors associated with, you know, not taking that approach and thinking reactively are going to lead you into trouble, I suppose.
I think it's at the last point of that Far Futures program, or really the way we look at all our strategic implications around, what are the tactical things that, if that is the future and being future first, what are those tactical actions? So it's not about just future gazing and thinking about 10 years ahead and all these speculative sort of thinking. It's really about, as Louise said, setting that vision and having an understanding of what, if we took your brand and threw it into the future, what is that context that you are needing to thrive or survive in? And then that should really determine the prioritization of the action you take today, and whether that is a case of keeping one revenue stream going for the short term, but then what are you investing in? What should you be thinking about? Starting to entertain maybe on the back burner, so that starts to come through and become relevant as and when you need it to. So it's not just about future first, you know, just going to the future and staying there. It's really about having that vision and working with clients through strategy to really unpack that as to what is the first action, and making sure that all clients go back to their desk and say, right, I can do something differently. I know what to do today, and not, with the paralysis paradox, feel paralyzed by the future and just feeling it's abstract and unobtainable and not knowing what to do. Lucy's got another question here just quickly, because she said she'd love to hear more about the global drivers you're observing. So I think, as Louise said at the top there, that we review these annually. Even in the last year, we've seen a lot of change happening. I think one of the clear, the digital nomads and tracking the future of flexibility is something that we're seeing really impacting that global driver of the urbanized or urbanizing world. We've seen a bit of a shift between we had before, or we were looking at kind of global versus local. But I think, you know, anybody that's been in the business long enough, we've probably been talking about localization for 20 years, but it's no longer really globalization versus, it's kind of really the two together. And we're starting to see this kind of micro globalization. What else has changed in the global drivers that we've seen? Well, I think one of the biggest ones that Louise touched upon, I think we were looking at, and a lot of brands, I think it was published in The Guardian recently, thinking about the climate change. And really, the biggest swing there is the acceleration to climate crisis, and the fact that we only have kind of 3 years to put things right. So that sense of urgency on that global driver, I think we'll start to see us push towards a lot of sustainable driven innovation and more regenerative practices being rolled out and embedded throughout businesses.
And thinking about accelerating technologies and everything that's going on with Meta at the moment, and, you know, some of the questions we felt so certain about maybe just a few years ago that are now up for debate again. So there's some really interesting kind of shifts happening in there, not just from a kind of a tangible technological hardware point of view, but also kind of the role it plays in society as well. I think, do we have time for one more question? One more question.
Which one? We're going to go for?
I was going to say Fleur Roberts has a question about value creation. So she says, can we talk a bit more about value creation and what we're seeing brands doing here? Who are they targeting their kind of value creation activities at? Is it, you know, thinking Gen Z, millennials? We know Gen Z.
I think in terms of what's I think again it comes from the global drivers. So Gen Z for sure. I think I mentioned that they have the spending power. So we're starting to see those really affect the commercials of brands and businesses. But here we also look at Zalfa, so we're also looking at the bottom end of generation A and the younger generation, how they're kind of interacting together. So I mean, it's that has a knock-on effect to so many things. We had a conversation only yesterday For example, when we're thinking about Zalfa, you know, we're seeing that TikTok is becoming the new search engine. So they're more likely to search and find information, influence, etc., through a TikTok than they would be just searching into Google. So that then starts to throw out things about, what's influential, how do you accredit that, what voices do they listen to, etc., etc. So it's quite a multi-dimensional, quite a lot of change that we're seeing when tracking that generation, but also the interaction with the generation below.
And I think also thinking about value in the future is a really big question, like what drives value, what does value mean? And so for a long time as businesses, we've thought of value in terms of financial terms, those KPIs, and actually now I think what we're seeing is, as we talked about in the Paralysis Paradox, and the big solution is a reframing of what the metrics of success for business are. So like what is value in the future? Like, where are you generating value, and how do you identify it? So thinking back to some of the things we talked about there, like when we're thinking about innovation, putting citizens before consumers, it's like really makes us need to rethink what we mean by value, because what's valuable to a citizen is not the same as what's valuable to you as a business as well.
100%. I'm just scrolling through to see if there's anything else that we can really, how do you, Abigail says, how do you account for regional specificity? So I think, as we mentioned, banging on about global drivers, the way that we look at our global drivers should be that those objectives, sort of the way that I articulate them internally, is like, whether you like it or not, these are happening. They should be very objective, they should be very factual based, and really they should be global drivers that we are seeing affect global businesses. But as Louise mentions, we went through our proprietary methodology, it's really when we start dialing down into those value shifts, that those value shifts are reflected in our contemporary context. So that interaction between the global driver, the conditions of which you are living in as a human, will be different because of the culture of the region or the political stance of the region, basically the sort of shifts within that global driver. So from a methodology point of view, you can speak to us more about all those different methodologies. We talked about qual, quant, consumer, local. We have a network of cultural navigators. So that would be one point where our cultural navigators would be briefed on our global drivers. They help us to really impact those global drivers with that regional or market nuance. And then it helps us to really understand the priorities within those shifts, to help us then prioritize and understand how those macro trends will then go on to manifest regionally. But yes, through qual, quant, and lots of other, as we said, we're method neutral. But if a client really wanted to unpack and really understand regional or market nuances and specificity, then that is where we would start to look at global drivers and different qual and quant methods to make sure that we are debiasing the research, but also eradicating bias from that too, and making sure that it is applicable and actionable for those different markets. What is an example of micro globalization? That would be onshoring. I think we talked a lot about offshoring and exporting, but we've seen, I think, with the problem with the Suez Canal last year, was it even this year? Time flies. Something that happens with supply chain has a massive knock-on effect. And we've seen, I think it's a brand such as Unilever, they've started to kind of unpack their supply chain. Instead of saying, having so many different parts to it, how can we start to break that down and take more control over it? It's obviously not as simple as that, because there's also, again, lots of tensions in the global drivers and arguments around the interdependencies. So yes, does micro globalization actually lead to the inability to meet global sustainability goals, etc.? But I think we've seen a lot of onshoring, countries wanting to be self-sufficient, taking control of supply chains and having more localized supply chains on the ground in those markets. And even a good case study from years ago, ahead of the curve, would have been Nike, who would use big data to understand like the footfall of a region and use that to understand product SKUs and inventory for what they need to be selling in that local store.
And I think like anything else, it feels like we're really hoping to aim towards a sense of more balance, I think, in the future. And that idea of micro-globalization to me really speaks to this balance between not that you get the benefits of globalization without the kind of really negative aspects where we haven't really thought about it before. And so really kind of rethinking globalization to work more in a more democratic way and be like, we're all able to reap the benefits of it. And as Rachel was saying, kind of, sustainability isn't obstructed by us kind of focusing more on localization rather than globalization, which, in the wrong direction could end up shutting down borders. But that sense of being able to be in control whilst also benefiting from kind of connectivity and connections and, as we were talking about, supply chains kind of working as they are, that feels like the ideal scenario that we would want to be heading towards.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. I can't see the numbers of participants, I think 200 or so. So thank you so much for today. And hopefully see you all soon.